This is Richard Wolff for Democracy at Work, responding to a question sent in to AskProfWolff from our Patreon community. This question poses the historical problem of the 1970s, a time characterized by what was called stagflation. That's a mixture of the word stagnant and the word inflation. And it means that even though we're not having economic growth in the sense of stagnant economy that isn't growing, nonetheless prices are rising on inflation, and the combination is stagflation. And the questioner correctly points out that the 1970s were a crucial change in America. We gave up the Keynesian economics that had existed basically since the Great Depression of the 1930s, an economics that focused on private capitalism being a problem and government intervention, all the things of the New Deal, all the anti-poverty programs and so on, being the necessary way to make capitalism work. And the irony was that by the 1970s, capitalism wasn't working real well. And this was used to undo the Keynesian system of government intervention, and it was used instead, particularly by economists like Milton Friedman and by government leaders shaped by those economists, Margaret Thatcher in England and Ronald Reagan in the United States, as the excuse, the justification for getting rid of government intervention, not completely, of course, but all of that devoted to maintaining well-being of the mass of people in favor of neoliberalism, it was sometimes called, privatization, deregulation, everything that has characterized dominant economic policy in the last several decades that we've all been living through. So the question from our Patreon community was, what happened with stagflation that made it possible for there to be such a switch, if you like, in our economic policy? And the questioner correctly also points out that the justification that it wasn't working well for people in stagflation, while true, led us into the modern era, which is even worse in terms of the growing gap between rich and poor, in terms of the instability of capitalism. In 2008, we had the second worst collapse in the history of this system. So what's going on? Well, let me respond briefly to this. Let's begin with the stagflation of the 60s into the 70s. Yes, it was a real problem. The economy wasn't keeping up the way it had in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. We had recovered from the war by the 1960s. Even into the 1950s, we had begun to do that pretty well, since the Second World War was much less devastating on the United States than on virtually every other participant, from Japan in Asia to Russia and Western Europe across that continent. So what happened? Well, in order to understand stagflation, you have to understand a basic reality of capitalism, which is constantly endangered by inflation. And here's how it works. Whenever people have the money to buy things, whatever the things are, there's always a question to be answered by the seller, by the capitalist, whether that capitalist is the manufacturer or the retailer who sells you something. There's always this question: how do I, as a capitalist, respond to people who have money, particularly if they have more money than they used to, and therefore can buy more? I can always do one of two things. I can respond to purchasing power by ordering more stuff, making it, if I'm the manufacturer, ordering it for sale if I'm the storekeeper. But I have a choice. I don't have to. I can respond to extra purchasing power not by producing or ordering more things to sell, more goods and services, but instead, under a free enterprise system, I can jack up the price. And you know, in some ways, it's always better to raise the price. It's a lot easier. You don't have to take the risk, you don't have to take the time to order more things, to pursue the order, to receive the order, to stock the order, to put it on the shelf. Instead, you just raise the prices. It's a much easier task, and you soak up the purchasing power that way. In a free enterprise system, that can happen. And if capitalists were to decide, for whatever reason, to respond to whatever people have to spend, not by producing more and thereby putting more people to work, but instead by raising the prices, then you wouldn't put people to work because you wouldn't be producing more. You'd just be soaking up the purchasing power in higher prices. That's what happened in the 60s and 70s. But in the classic way of American politics and American capitalism, the anger of people justified that they weren't being given jobs, which they could have been, but instead were suffering an inflation, which they didn't want. Instead of people being angry at a capitalism that worked that way, their anger was deflected. It was shunted over onto Keynesian economics, government intervention, as if that were the problem, which it wasn't. And the solution was then told to them, deregulate, get the government out, which was done. That's what the Reagan Revolution, the Thatcher Revolution, neoliberalism, that's what they did. Did that solve the problem? Not at all. Unemployment basically got worse. It's a little disguised now because we have millions of people leaving the labor force. Our labor force participation rate in this country is lower now than it was 5 years ago, etc., etc. And the condition of the American economy, the inequality, the instability that exploded in 2008, they weren't overcome, they weren't solved. And the reason, the basic reason, is always this one. The problem is the capitalist system, not going from this form to that form. That game of making us think that if we get rid of this form and have that form, no Keynesian, neoclassical, neoliberal, no neoliberal, let's go back to Keynes, that doesn't solve the problem because the problem is the system. This is Richard Wolff, hoping that this response to our Patreon community's question is of interest to many of you. Thank you.